Didn't take the first click. Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, May 4th, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today continues Phase 3 with our 13th webinar in the series of webinars on the topic of comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Its author and chairman of the committee is Neil Waldrop, for whom I am turning the facilitation of this webinar over to right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. This is an exciting discussion that we have been having, and I am sure that all of you who are participating with me will contribute very interesting insights today. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, I would suggest that if you do not already have the document Revelation Revealed, it would be helpful for you to download it so that you will be in a better position to follow along our discussion and understand what we are just talking about. You would download it by consulting the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, which is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle of it. The link that would permit you to download the document Revelation Revealed is near the bottom of the homepage. In addition, because those of you who are watching on YouTube do not have the opportunity to ask us questions while we are conducting the webinar, I will describe an option whereby you could send us in a question in writing. You would do that by using the email address that is listed at the bottom of the homepage of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, namely info@globalendeavor.net. Such a question might be in relation to something that someone says during our program, or perhaps just ideas that you have as you are watching it. If we decide to use your question, we reserve the right to edit it, and we would then discuss it in a group fashion so that the answer you would get in a subsequent program would be a collective response from the panel as a whole, not just from me. Well, now I would like to start the discussion for today in a substantive sense. We have reached page 109 of the document Revelation Revealed, and in particular, we have reached the major heading, Christianity, Key Features and Practices. We will now go through the various aspects that are identified on that page and subsequent pages, and we will talk about each of these features and practices in some depth so as to exchange ideas concerning the underlying implications and meaning of these practices. The first of these ideas is a religion about Jesus instead of the religion of Jesus. Now, we did discuss this before in a preceding webinar, but I would like to precipitate or stimulate a certain amount of additional thoughts. And the thought that I have for you today that I would like to put before you has to do with the nature of stories. Whether the idea of a religion about Jesus largely came about because human beings prefer stories, because it is easy to relate to a story. It is an entertainment in a sense, but it is also a narrative which allows someone to sit back and listen or just enjoy the progression of events, which is a major contrast to the exertion required to think personally and creatively about God, about the nature of God, about one's relationship to God. So is this psychological preference for stories a feature in the way that Christianity developed into a religion about Jesus? Doreen, I would offer you the first opportunity to comment on that.
Okay, no problem. Well, when I was looking at some of the discourses on true religion that Jesus spoke to the apostles, it was so extraordinary. I mean, that to me kind of resonates within a person when he tells them, go off by yourself and discover the divine within your own mind. Unemotional. He says, make the greatest discovery for the human soul. Now, it's so poetic how he speaks, and it was so beautiful. I didn't understand why they didn't carry this forward. And people remembering what these apostles told them at the beginning. So the stories never carried down, even what he had said. It's really funny. He says, you could talk about God, but go find him and discover him for yourself. It's a wonderful thing. But I'll go on, and I had discovered some things I was investigating. And it said in the first century, the first Christians to preach about the crucifixion and the risen Christ, the church struggled against this aberrant doctrine. And I don't know, I came across something docetic. It said heresy claimed that Jesus only seemed to be, that claimed that Jesus only seemed to be human, suffer and die. He really was a pure spirit. And it said they struggled against the Christian Gnosticism, the elitists, the heresies, that he did not resurrect and go to heaven. The facts that Jesus became so distorted, and the doctrines was essential to carry out the Father's, message, so that they preached the gospel, and that's what became the tradition. So they had to do it. Well, it was funny because they said the first generation of Christians hardly read the gospel, but they absorbed it through prayer, through homilies, and of course, the life in the church community. It was rare that they could read or even own pages of the gospel. So there was a lot of disagreement over the books, which belonged to the gospel and which didn't. But further reading it, it was really so bizarre. They said there were so many different authors that claimed to be from the disciples of Jesus: Peter, John, James, Philip, the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene, Barnabas, Pontius Pilate, and so on. And they even said there were infancy gospels about miracles that Jesus performed as a boy. So I could understand how they had to make one message and how to repeat that message so that people were not terribly confused. But they said to consider the gospel apart from tradition was unthinkable. And whoever interprets according to his own perverse inclinations is the firstborn of Satan, so that you are really condemned. And then one more thing I found was a primitive church document that described the early order and practices and ethics of the 12 apostles. And I think that was in Greek, and it called the Didache. Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. And it said these teachings were from either AD 48 somewhere till 90. And before some of the New Testament documents were written. And it was really simple what they did. They practiced, they drank wine, they gave thanks, they broke bread, calling the Eucharist. And the confessions of sins was simple, but what ended up happening, the church now had to take a larger role. So they said that, the church said, if you're going to have a mass, and it's got to be a sacrifice, it has to take place in the church. And the sacrament became the blood and the flesh of God. So everything had moved and shifted from what the original intent was. And of course, that meant to me that they had to keep taking back their power. So to have one message, and I understand why they did it. And of course, what you said, the parables, and people resonate and they remember much better things they repeat and the stories they hear. Of course, whether it's true or not, but you can't just put out stories that are erroneous. What does that say? And everybody is talking about something else. But anyway, that's how I, follow it through. And it was more understandable to me why they had to control the stories.
Thank you, Doreen. I would like to offer some clarifications in regard to part of your comments about written material.
You have nailed.
We cannot assume the ability of the early Christians to read coherent masses of material. First of all, the level of literacy was very low at the time. But even if one were talking about someone who did know how to read, the other point was that the New Testament as such did not exist. The various writings that eventually were accepted to compose the New Testament were not put in a relatively ordered fashion until the middle of the 4th century, about 360 AD. Before that time, various documents circulated. Some were ultimately accepted, some were not. And some of them were relatively reliable. Others were what we consider now to be relatively strange. The epistles of Paul were, it is agreed, among the first Christian writings that were preserved and maintained. The Gospels were written after the epistles of Paul. But in any event, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not available in all congregations, even in generations subsequently. In some places, they had one, but not another one. So the question that we have has to do with telling stories And the Christian stories that are crucial are those about the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus, because that formed a coherent theology about his importance to the believer. And these were the stories really that are the burden of my question, because they ultimately became the center of the Christian faith. George, would you like to jump in here? George, you're muted.
Myself here. I was typing something. I have a little bit of a hoarse voice, so hopefully you can hear me all right. Okay. Yeah, your question about Christianity being more about the story, I mean, it's certainly relevant. Christianity is a religion about Jesus. It is not the religion of Jesus. Covered that, I think, in detail. Jesus, tells us his gospel of the kingdom, quote, makes its chief appeal to the divine spirit of my Father, which resides in the mind of man, end quote. So the overemphasis of by Christianity upon the person of Jesus chiefly appeals to the human mind, it seems to me. Which ties in with your question about the appeal of the story of Jesus.
George, excuse me. I'm sorry to jump in here. Your voice is a little bit hoarse, as you have said.
Right.
But I think it is more important that your volume seems to drop off after a short amount. So if you could simply try to speak a little bit louder, that would help all of us hear you.
How about this? Is this a little better?
That's better. Yes, thank you.
Where would you like me to?
No, why don't you just continue your thought?
Okay.
You
All right.
were saying about the emphasis on the stories.
The overemphasis by Christianity upon the person of Jesus chiefly appeals to the human mind, it seems to me, which ties in with your question about it being mostly a story, the appeal of the story of Jesus, the person of Jesus. And I mean, it certainly makes a compelling story, but it's also true that the personality of Jesus is far easier to discern than the reality of the divine spirit of the Father. Jesus is somebody, the reality of Jesus is something that everybody can immediately grasp to one degree or another. Whereas, how many people can say they know the divine spirit? That was a revelation by Jesus. Nobody even realized that spirit was present. And so that in looking around in paper 5, section 4, let me step back. Christianity, there are lots and lots of problems that we've identified with Christianity. It's hardly necessary to go through them, but I came across something in paper 5, section 4 by the divine counselor. And he says that Christianity presents a transcendent anthropomorphic concept of God who is like Jesus. Let me quote. This is from paper 5, section 4. An exalted anthropomorphism is the highest attainment level of purely evolutionary religion. Christianity has elevated the concept of anthropomorphism from the ideal of the human to the transcendent and divine concept of the person of the glorified Christ. This is the highest anthropomorphism that man can ever conceive. It's really, end quote. This really strikes me as an extraordinary statement. What the divine counselor is saying is that the glorified Christ, as he's presented in Christianity, is the highest possible conception of a personal God attainable by any evolutionary religion, now or in the future. Strikes me as being extraordinary. In Christianity, the glorification of Jesus as the Christ, the divine Son of God, occurs with his resurrection from the dead. And Christianity is almost exclusive. So this This is why Christianity almost exclusively focuses upon the glorified Christ. At least I interpret it that way. And the glorified Christ is the Son of God. And this focus is highlighted by a remarkable fact. Going through the Catholic Encyclopedia, and looking at the definitions for Son of God and Son of Man, in the four Gospels, the Son of Jesus is only referred to as the Son of God 54 times. That's how all of his followers referred to him. But in the four Gospels, the followers of Jesus never referred to him as the Son of Man. The title Son of Man occurs 81 times in the Gospels, but is only used by Jesus to refer to himself. And the more I thought about that, the more extraordinary it seems. I mean, the Ranch book makes quite a point of identifying these two titles for us. And they're both found in the Bible, but in the Bible, the followers, the apostles, the disciples, none of them ever refer to Jesus as the Son of Man. It's only Jesus who refers to himself by that title. And in his 19 post-resurrection appearances, Jesus always appeared in a human form. The apostles assumed, and the disciples appeared to assume that this was material. Of course, the Ranch book says it was his Morancha form. But this glorified form of Jesus, according to the divine counselor, is the highest possible anthropomorphic ideal of the person of God. So the glorified Christ is inseparable from the personality of Jesus, the Son of Man, which is the personality of Michael, of Nebadon, the Son of God. So to see the personality of the glorified Christ, as presented in Christianity, is to see the personality of the divine Son of God, if we believe the divine counselor. And to see Jesus, we're told over and over, is to see the Father. So another, anthropomorphism is not infrequently a label used to disparage religion, but there's no such thing as a personal God who, in order to be, personality is only apparent to us and other people and other humans. So God, if he's going to be at least personal, he has to be anthropomorphic in that sense of being a personality. If he's not like us, then we can't communicate with him, something that Nathaniel argued with Rodin when he convinced him that the Father has a personality. So the other importance about this anthropomorphic ideal is that of Christ is that it's consistent with the concept of the personality of God. In paper 1, section 5, the divine counselor tells us, in the contemplation of deity, the concept of personality must be divested of the idea of corporeality. The material body is not indispensable to personality in either man or God. The corporeality area is shown in both extremes of human philosophy. In pantheism, since God has no body, he is not, in materialism, since man loses his body at birth, at death, he ceases to exist as a personality. In pantheism, since God has no body, he is not, therefore, a person. The superhuman type of progressing personality functions in a union of mind and spirit, end quote. And then the perfecter of wisdom assures us that the Father, quote, is a spiritual person at the center of all things, end quote. And then in another place, did he move, universal pandemonium would be precipitated, for there converge in him at the residential center of the universal lines of gravity from the ends of creation. End quote. So the Father has no material body, but he is a true person who dwells at a specific location in the universe of universes. So I've kind of rambled on and touched on a number of different ideas here. I'll leave it there.
George, we admire your scholarship and your ability to pursue these various interesting ideas that do relate to each other. So I appreciate it very much. I would say, as I turn to Charles, that for the sake of summarizing aspects of what George said, it seems to me that in addition to the question of the story mode, which I started with when I turned to the rest of you as a tool for discussion, George has added the idea of the concept of a person and the figure of Jesus, a human person, as being an accessible portrayal of God or of a divine person that the early Christians and indeed later Christians could understand and appreciate, because after all, Jesus was a human being. So would you link these two elements together, the interest in stories and the portrayal of a human being as being divine, as factors that cause Christianity to settle into a religion about Jesus instead of the religion of Jesus? That's a question to you, Charles.
Oh, not necessarily.
Well, give us your spin on it, please.
Not. I'd be happy to do that. Thank you for the invitation. To be sure. Oh, by the way, George, I always enjoy your meanderings and ramblings. You need never try to account for that or apologize for that, I think. Anyway, it isn't the storytelling per se, it's the content always. Stories can be used as a medium and for all kinds of ends. The resulting contrast over the centuries between a religion about Jesus and a religion of Jesus was not due to Jesus' ways of teaching and living. Jesus went to great lengths to ensure, or try to ensure, humanly, the emphasis on his teachings and not his personality. However, he ran against this human tendency, this very strong tendency, to emphasize the monument over the man. And I think it stems for factors that are both direct and indirect, due to the absence of the normal planetary leadership we were supposed to have, particularly Adam and Eve. I think human beings reacting in a childish way as children, in terms of the quality of mind, the level they're at, oftentimes seeking for the good parent, and hence the monument over the man. We tend to, in the risen Christ or the glorified Christ concepts my colleagues have mentioned, make them heroic because of our needs of security and reassurance, seems to me. And again, I think this is due to direct and indirect factors concerning the absence of planetary leadership in the way it was planned. So when Jesus declared himself the Son of God, he had to do that to really achieve a certain validity in the minds of his listeners. That the Son of Man was a concept that, although valid, was one that was not sufficiently reassuring. But a deity, being in the presence of a deity or a bestowed deity or incarnated deity, yes, that would be reassuring. So hence this emphasis on the monument over the man. That was one of the factors for this contrast between about and of. Another is Paul's tendency to disseminate the religion of Jesus, a certain amount of irony perhaps, by borrowing from many different subcultures, ended up contributing substantially to a religion about Jesus, even a Pauline version of Jesus. And the use of the word Pauline is in the book. It's not original with me. So Paul is a major factor. Peter and his enthusiasm. Peter may have been the greatest preacher that ever lived on your rancher, greatest human preacher that ever lived on your rancher. I say preacher, not teacher. He was so relieved that Jesus did accept him and did rise from the dead and so forth and so on, that he, I think, unwittingly, in terms of the long-term effect, contributed to this this tendency to make heroic the monument and not the man. And in any case, there's another factor here. The religion of Jesus commands a certain spirituality, a spiritual way to live. Literally, not as a figure of speech or metaphor, but actually, over the material realm, over material considerations. To follow Jesus, as he told his apostles when he was giving them the new commandment. You are, first of all, my friends, not my servants. You're my friends, even though you call me master. So I don't call you servants. I call you my friends. But you will remain my friends if you love your fellow mortals. I'm paraphrasing someone. If you love your fellow mortals as the Father and I have loved you. And that's a spiritual proposition. And George alluded to this to a degree. I think he's correct in raising it up and bringing it up. The notion to love others as God loves them is greater than the traditional, conventional golden rule of brotherly love. It transcends brotherly love. It transcends philosophic objectivity. It transcends everything and becomes a father's love, to assume the father's position. And that's worth a whole panel discussion in itself. It's that important. So the religion of Jesus requires something of a spiritual response that many individuals, many Urantians, and I use the word Urantians correctly and accurately, that is to say all human beings on Urantia are Urantians, not readers of the Urantia book only, the way it's sometimes used. I have to say that because there's some confusion about that. Urantians have a tendency to go from the simple to the complex, if they ever get to the complex, not the other way around. And the idea of loving your fellow mortals, the way God the Father and the way Jesus in his bestowal life loved us and loves us, continues to love us, is just too demanding for a lot. They won't do that. They simply won't do that. It's too demanding. They could do it, but they won't do it. And they decline to do it. And I think that also contributed toward Christianity morphing into a religion about him, not of him. I'll close with that.
Thank you, Charles. I have now the duty to turn to my immediate associate and colleague in running these programs, the Vice Chairman, Mr. Robert DeBold. I don't mean to be critical in saying it that way. That was perhaps a bit more formal than I had to be. But in any event, I have now given him this full range of predecessors whom he has every right to comment on. And I will refrain from pointing to any particular element, while also saying, Bob, that you have every right to bring up something additional that no one else has mentioned. Please.
Great. Thanks, Neil. Always appreciate your questions. In past webinars or when we were on the Cosmic Citizen, I made the comment that, you can prepare for this facilitation that you do, but when you throw those curveball questions, it really challenges the thought process, to say the least, and it's sometimes better not to go first. I do have a couple of different kinds of thoughts about this. Your question was, how and did stories have any way to to drive this methodology that the early church had with establishing the religion about Jesus rather than of his messages, of his gospel. And I think that there's some really good validity there, but there's a little bit of a paradox. If we look at part 4 of the Urantia Papers, the book, it's called The Life and Teachings of Jesus. There's lots of stories in there about Jesus. Nalda at the well, when he was in the field and he took many of these stories are in the Bible. So what's the difference here? Well, first I want to make a comment that it does seem to me that there's a major difference, but this idea about the religion about Jesus drives the focus where it has to be stories, but they're different kind of stories. They're not parabolic analogy. They're not parables. Some of the parables actually that Jesus had remained. And frankly, that might be the part of Christianity that should be immortalized, which is what the Midwayer said, I believe, in paper 195 or 196 at the end of the book. What this about does, I think, is it crowds out the message. Crowding out is an economic term that says that if the governments or the states put in public financing and they put in, and they put an overabundance of it, it might crowd out private financing and creates an imbalance in the way things are invested. These stories, though, Charles mentioned the monument over the man, a very interesting thought. I would also call it the man over the message. What has happened with this idea of a religion about Jesus and rather than of his message and of his gospels is that there's a focus on miracles, stories that are not necessarily useful as parables. Parables have this unique ability to be able to not memorialize an individual, but to take a story and develop it so that it has general and universal applicability. So, an individual can come at it almost like a parabola from almost any vector and really see the truth. So basically, the truth of Jesus's gospel messages has been crowded out because of this focus on those things that are non-parabolic to his message, which are the stories about his life. One interesting part of the papers talks about Confucius and some of the 6th century individuals when there was that great spiritual awakening at the 6th century BC. And if I could just kind of read a paragraph here, because it's kind of instructive about what can happen in almost any society, and especially I think it's relevant to the stories about with this idea of the religion about Jesus. Confucius was a younger contemporary of Lao in 6th century China. I'm reading from paper 94, section 6, paragraph 9. Confucius based his doctrines upon the better moral traditions of the long history of the yellow race, and he was also somewhat influenced by the lingering traditions of the Salem missionaries. His chief work consisted in the compilation of the wise sayings of ancient philosophers. He was a rejected teacher during his lifetime, but his writings and teachings have ever since exerted a great influence in China and Japan. Confucius set a new pace for the shaman in that he put morality in the place of magic. But he built too well. He made a new fetish out of the order and established a respect for ancestral conduct that is still venerated by the Chinese at the time of the writing. So by building this, well, it's not necessarily a false image, but the image of the Christ has crowded out as though it was done too well, and it's taken a very long time. I think probably until about the 17th or 18th century for theologians to start to think about what is the religion of Jesus. And I think that we're seeing a little bit of a trend in that direction. So it's a great question. These stories are loaded with the strength of a parabolic analogy that that the parables do, but they need to be used that way. Back over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I always appreciate your statement that I like to throw curveballs, if not necessarily at you, at the group as a whole. But some of your comments have given me an idea for a question that I really do think is a curveball, because it pertains to your description of part 4 of the Urantia book as composed of stories, or partly of stories, which it is. Now, I will offer you the opportunity to speculate on the creative intentions of the revelators, who devoted 1/3 of the 2,097 pages of the fifth epical revelation, to the life and teachings of Jesus. And in asking you about this, I wonder whether you think that their creative intent in devoting this much space was to tell the stories better, or possibly to build in so much of the message that the message too would receive greater attention than has been the case on the average over the past 2,000 years.
That's an interesting question and an interesting context. I always perceive the 4 parts of the book, where the first 3 parts are building our cosmic consciousness, are expanding our view of the cosmos, and that part 4 then, which are these very similar stories, many of them are pulled almost exactly from the Bible, but they've got little bits of twists where the midwayers had a little bit more perspective than what came through in the Gospels. So I think that the revelators, based on the thought that you're throwing out here, put part 4 after the origin and history of the cosmos, so that as we read these somewhat leavened, somewhat I guess that's the best word I can use right there, leavened stories, as well as the complete life of Joshua ben Joseph, all the way from when he got his instructions as Michael from the Union of Days Emmanuel. That's a cosmic picture that just wasn't available to the early apostles, to the early disciples, and to the early theologians who tried to rationalize the fact that they needed to build these stories around a hero worshiping. By the way, I meant to mention that Charles did bring up, and I think that's where both Doreen and George are moving, in that this idea of an anthropomorphic hero is pretty important throughout all of our history, probably because of the strength of the Adamic default that really never solved that natural human problem of trying to venerate a hero. Lots of psychological things there, I suppose. So to sum it up again, I think it's I think that the revelators had built the first 3 parts of the paper, of the book, to build this more cosmic picture, to understand. Well, obviously, the idea of personality changes everything. So that when we now view this entire life and teachings of Jesus, we can now interpolate these things a little bit better and bring the message out, and where it's not crowded out now, because now it's got a whole cosmos to be able to be looked at. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate your answer, and I'm not sure I would call your answer a curveball. I thought it was pretty straight myself. But I see now that Doreen would like to speak, and I will now recognize her. You're muted, please. Doreen, you're muted. Okay.
Okay. Thank you for reminding me. I do appreciate what Bob had just offered. But for me, when I think about the Urantia book, and I think this is for the next 1,000 years, you're appealing to the planet. You're not just appealing to Christians and straightening out some of the, Apocrypha or whatever it is. I had never read the Old or the New Testament, just pieces here and there. My best information came from the Urantia book, and that turned me on to look further. But I think, well, for people that have other religions, and they would never pick this up, the way they, and I know they argued about, the Midwayers argued about what to put in, should they and shouldn't they, but it was the most refreshing thing when I picked this up and didn't know anything about Christianity and didn't know anything about Jesus. I thought to myself, oh my God, this is real. This is not some story from the Bible that people made up to make somebody look good or, or enhance an image. It was wonderful. And the way they cohesively put it and spelled out, especially the idea, because the idea that Jesus, that Mary was not a virgin and that he had brothers and, and a sister and all this stuff that people said this is not possible. And of course, even, many of the different parts of Christianity didn't believe that either. But of course, each came to their own conclusion and preached whatever, I guess, people wanted to hear. But to me, it was so refreshing to look at this section of the book and understand, and it attracted me so. Like I said, to be born again, I would say definitely. But if it was written any differently, and if it was just dry knowledge or like the Bible, I would have just cast it aside. So it was alive. It was real. And, when you know something, like they always say, when you see it, you know it. And there is no words that could replace that. You can't prove anything, but you just know it.
Thank you. I think we could probably pursue these thoughts for quite a while, but I believe it is better to move on to the next segment. The next segment is headed The Atonement, segment small b. And George, I wonder if you would be good enough to read this paragraph headed The Atonement to us from page 109 of the document Revelation Revealed.
Sure. B, the atonement. Christianity's core contention, almost ranking as a trademark, is the assertion that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, thereby redeeming humanity and creating a spiritual pathway that enables a sincere believer to be saved, i.e., to go to heaven. But only if he or she has also honored the commandments and the other moral precepts that Christianity propounds. The religion's most prominent symbol is the cross or crucifix, a constant reminder of its central theme.
Thank you. I think this statement about the symbolism of Christianity is convincing in itself. The problem we have with it is the implication of sacrifice. In effect, the idea that God was being appeased by the death of Jesus on the cross, and that in effect, by dying that way, he was atoning for the collective sins of humanity. This, in effect, makes God a vindictive judge rather than a loving father. Charles, would you like to comment on that, or perhaps some other element of the atonement doctrine that particularly attracts you?
Well, as a noun, atonement was, according to my dictionary, coined in the early 16th century, the year 1513. It did have the definition, reconciliation of God and man through sacrificial death of Jesus. As a verb, to atone, which I believe is French, was coined as a verb later in the 16th century, in the year 1593, means to become reconciled or in harmony. It's an interesting rationalization, the atonement doctrine. And some explanation had to, if Jesus was, not if, since he declared himself the Son of God, and not only the Son of Man, not just a man among mortals, but also a divine being in nature and origin and destiny, how then could he be crucified? This being who commands angels, legions of angels. I've always thought of the atonement as a rationalization to answer that question. That it correctly assigns a good motive or good intent to Jesus. Jesus allowed the crucifixion to occur. He permitted it. He submitted to it as a acceptance to the will of God. Remember, in the garden, he had asked for that cup to be passed, and I believe it was the justice will, hence God's will, not to pass, not because God wanted him to die in that manner, but he had to die some kind of a death, physical death, as part of his bestowal. Wasn't going to vanish into thin air miraculously. And he had become, in effect, an enemy of the state being blended with the Sanhedrin. They had a union of church and state. And I got a different phone. The crucifixion was, I believe, an assassination. It was a state-sponsored assassination with the approval of Roman Empire, Roman authorities. And the Sanhedrin, even though Pilate, who authorized it, knew he was innocent, that Jesus was innocent. So the atonement doctrine is a way to rationalize that, given the Master's declaration of divine as well as human nature and attributes. And it's unfortunate. It distorted a tremendous amount. It's as if God would be satisfied with an act that was unkind, unjust, and unfair, and even will it to be. There was a certain momentum. In other words, God, the Father said in effect to Jesus, I believe, your followers won't be able to take special advantage. So if you use your divine power, your way, to avoid this, you'll be doing something your followers can't do. And I think that's why he wanted him to basically adhere to one of his original decisions, which was to stick with human instrumentalities, human means, until his human bestowal was completed. And the atonement doctrine, however, puts the emphasis on the infinite, Father infinite, that he willed it. And perhaps the actual causality here, the actual reasoning behind Jesus' decision to go ahead with it, was just too subtle to be grasped. I've long believed that one of the tasks of the teaching of the Rancher book is to correct that, to rebalance that God would not be satisfied, an infinite power would not be satisfied with this little finite, torturous mode of capital punishment that's designed to postpone dying and maximize pain while you're going through a longer period of dying. That's what crucifixion was, how it was designed to do, what it was designed to do by the Romans. And the Romans, incidentally, had nothing against Jesus, but they reserved the decision-making on capital punishment to their authority. They didn't allow subject peoples on their own authority to visit capital felonies, as we would call it today. And that's why the Sanhedrin had to get Pontius Pilate's approval, just to put that in there. It was the Sanhedrin, and they assassinated our master. And they knew better. They knew what they were doing. They gave him an unfair trial. He didn't get all he was supposed to get. It was rigged, terribly rigged, horribly rigged, and it was a horrible death. He died within several hours, when many a man as strong and young as he was could have lasted days, and did. So it's a great myth that should be corrected, in my view. And in evolutionary terms, sooner would be better than later.
Thank you, Charles. Bob, in turning to you, I would ask you to comment on the relationship between the idea of Jesus' death on the cross as a sacrifice and the practice of sacrificial offerings, for example, of animals or fruit and so on, as part of traditional evolutionary religion, and whether, in effect, this psychology pushed the early Christians so heavily toward interpreting Jesus' death as a sacrifice that they, in effect, had to do that. What do you think?
I think there's no question that that's right. There's a cosmic picture here that the divine counselor puts in paper 4. Now, a divine counselor, of course, is the council of the Trinity. That's about as high as I can imagine. That there'd be a personality that would write something in a book that we would be able to read. So let me just read a sentence from paper 4, which is the early part I was just mentioning before, that these cosmic pictures that were then afforded, and I'll try to get to the answer or the thought of this, of what you brought up there. This barbarous idea of appeasing an angry God, of propitiating an offending Lord, of winning the favor of deity through sacrifices and penance, and even by the shedding of blood, represents a religion wholly puerile and primitive, a philosophy unworthy of an enlightening age of science and truth. So that's in paragraph 4 of section 5. So that's not a cosmic picture yet. But then this divine counselor flips over and says that the bestowal, this is a couple paragraphs later, the bestowal of a paradise sun in your world was inherent in the situation of closing a planetary age. Now we're getting cosmic. Now we're getting way above anything that any religion on this planet has ever thought about or come up with. It was inescapable, and it was not made necessary for the purpose of winning the favor of God. This bestowal also happened to be the final personal act of a creator son in the long adventure of earning the experiential sovereignty of his universe. So they're talking in general terms, of course, of the entire super universes and the pattern of what a creator son has to do. But then they come back with this next sentence, or I should say that the divine counselor, not they, the divine counselor comes back and then blasts with all the trumpets here. What a travesty upon the infinite character of God. This teaching that his fatherly heart, in all its austere coldness and hardness, was so untouched by the misfortunes and sorrows of his creatures that his tender mercies were not forthcoming until he saw his blameless son bleeding and dying upon the cross of Calvary. I think we've mentioned this before, that the Revelation doesn't really teach in the negative, but this is one where they kind of come out pretty strong and say that this is, as Charles said, that sooner than later this idea of atonement has to get crowded out by some other positive thought, which as you asked, Neil, did I think that this was, or is it a thought that this would have been something that happened because of previous religious practices of sacrifice. And I think, yes, I think it was inevitable that to be able to bring pagan humanity in at the time, that this was almost an inevitable thought that had to happen. And if you match that up with this whole hero worship idea that we talked about earlier, now you've got a perfect storm, so to speak. One other thing I just wanted to mention, I may have said this in one of the previous webinars, is that, and I can't say this any stronger, I've kind of looked at the hierarchy of some of the adulterated teachings. And it's my belief, and I've said this, I'm going to actually read this. It is my belief that atonement sits at the top of a very deep and extensive hierarchy that carries with it what I consider pathological and antagonistic human behaviors. If we think that if humanity believes that an infinite Father, an infinite God who is also a loving Father, as the divine counselor threw those bombs and bullets at us, that his tender mercies are not forthcoming until he sees his blameless son bleeding and dying on the cross. What kind of a cognitive dissonance does that create that has to be rectified somehow? So while you don't attack atonement, you see it as inevitable, but it needs to be crowded out with some very positive and loving messages. Over.
Thank you, Bob. I would now offer a variation of this question we're discussing in addressing myself to George. The last part of the paragraph that he read for us has to do with the cross or crucifix being a reminder of the theme. Now, I wonder whether it is possible for the cross or the crucifix to be re-understood instead of as a sacrifice, instead of as an atonement, as a measure of love, that Jesus so loved the world that he went through this in order to demonstrate his love, and for that matter, to demonstrate the Father's love. Is it possible to hope, indeed, is it possible to imagine that Christianity can adopt this very different idea of what the cross symbolizes?
Well, that's a really hard question. It's hard to imagine Christianity being Christianity without this idea of sacrifice. When I was looking in the book about this, in paper 149, they talk a little bit about the atonement doctrine, and they say the apostles made two really serious mistakes. Let me read the sentence from paper 149, section 2. At the end of paragraph 2, it says, aside from the incorporation of many teachings from the Persian mysteries and much of the Greek philosophy into early Christianity, two great mistakes were made. And in the next paragraph, the number one mistake was the effort to connect, quote, the effort to connect the gospel teaching directly onto Jewish theology, as illustrated by the Christian doctrines of the atonement. The teaching that Jesus was the sacrificed son who would satisfy the Father's stern justice and appease the divine wrath. So this, I think, Bob hit on a very good point, which is that in religion, in paper 89, they talk about sin, sacrifice, and atonement. It goes way back to the beginnings of religion in the human experience. So there was definitely that long history which would sort of lead to this idea. But aside from that, from what the midwayers are saying was that this great mistake, what they call a great mistake of the atonement doctrine, it sounds like this could have been avoided. They didn't have to. It says at the end of that paragraph, it's and essentially this was Paul. These teachings, that is of the atonement, originated in a praiseworthy effort to make the gospel of the kingdom more acceptable to disbelieving Jews. They did not, though these efforts failed as far as winning the Jews was concerned, they did not fail to confuse and alienate many honest souls in all subsequent generations. So that's a pretty, well, I don't know, it's a pretty scathing denunciation, or it's a pretty scathing identification of a really, really serious error that was made. And it sounds like it was not inevitable. This was apparently a choice that they made to try and reach out, to go backwards and reach out to Jewish theology and try to drag more of Jewish theology into the gospel of the kingdom where it didn't belong. So.
Thank you, George. I would comment, to the best of my understanding, that the atonement doctrine, the idea of a sacrifice, that Jesus died for our spiritual welfare, was an invention of the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
And whether he had to do it or not is an interesting question. We will never know, but he did. And I agree with you, and for that matter, with the passage that you quoted, that this pulled in his effort to take upon some ideas from the Jewish past to appeal to people of Jewish background. And as you said, it didn't work, but it never failed to astound and annoy millions, hundreds of millions of people for the next 2,000 years. So in asking you whether Christianity can take a different view of this, I was trying to put the most positive interpretation. I understand your reluctance to conclude that they can't, because the teachings of Paul are so deeply embedded in traditional Christianity, and therefore the construction of what the cross means likewise so deeply embedded, that it's hard to imagine them setting that aside. Anyway, thank you. You want to add additional remarks, George?
Yeah, I would just like to say that I don't think this is such a central foundation stone of Christianity. I don't think you can remove it and still call it Christianity. Maybe you could call it post-Christianity. Maybe you could call it Urantia-inspired Christianity. I mean, you'd have to come up with a different name, because the atonement doctrine in all branches of Christianity, Catholic, Protestant, and otherwise, without the atonement doctrine, there's no justification for the survival of the individual. In Christianity, it's always the sacrifice of Jesus that makes possible the salvation of human beings. Without the sacrifice, there is no salvation. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Doreen, I will now give you the opportunity to conclude this discussion, since the others have spoken before you. I was trying to emphasize the reconstruction of ideas about God, moving from sacrifice and atonement to an emphasis on love, and asking, in effect, whether love can become central instead of sacrifice. And I know that we would all like this, but it is a very difficult proposition for the reasons that George gave, and indeed for other reasons too. So let me give you an opportunity to comment as best you may. Once again, you
did. Thank you. I have to remind myself. Well, it's funny because I believe in the Jewish religion, there is a Day of Atonement, and every year. And I remember when I was a kid, I think that's the day where you sacrifice not eating, and if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so you asked about I think that it can turn to love. It's like anything else. You repeat a message and you repeat it. Maybe it takes 50 years, whatever. It's advertising. And eventually the generations that were so seeped in the old tradition will pass away, and the younger people are searching for something new anyway. So I find, yes, the message of love is positive. Who would not want a positive message? And to look at it the way the Urantia book had wrote, it said, the cross is a high symbol of sacred service. It's devotion to life, to the welfare and salvation of you. The cross is not the symbol of sacrifice to the innocent Son of God in the place of guilty sinners, and in order to appease the wrath of an offended God. But it does stand forever on earth and throughout the vast universe as a sacred symbol of the good bestowing themselves upon the evil and saving them by this very devotion of love. So I believe that's where you're coming from. And it says it doesn't stand as the token, the cross does stand as the token of the highest form of unselfish service, the supreme devotion of the full bestowal of a righteous life in the service of wholehearted ministry, even in death, the death of the cross. And the very sight of this great symbol of the bestowal life of Jesus truly inspires us all to want to go and to do likewise. And I truly believe it's just like maybe people are more prone to listen to negative messages, but I think going forward, they've heard enough negative messages. And if you want to bring people back to any religion, anything, it has to be something that is beautiful and good and true and happy. And so, okay, that was the past. You know, it's like taking down the statues today because it reminds people of the past, and that's not acceptable, the history. Well, I don't see people marching against it right now, but I think they could do the same. And if they start preaching it and teaching it, I believe that the message of love is the most powerful thing. How could it not resonate in everyone? How could you not replace that with something that was a symbol of blood and sacrifice and torture and all this stuff? I mean, that's so primitive religion. Just put it out there and say what it was and what it is and what it is to be. That's my personal feeling. I don't have any attachment to the cross or symbols, but I believe that everything changes in time. Nothing stays the same.
Doreen, you have confirmed my belief that you would come up with a positive message to conclude our discussion on this particular question. I hope you are right.
Neil?
Yes, Charles, now that Doreen has contributed a positive message, I assume that you want to contrast with that by coming up with something negative. But in any case, it's your turn.
No, furthest from my mind. Never occurred to me. But there are 2 points. One has been raised and one has not been raised. I'd like to elaborate.
Go ahead, please.
If I may. Thank you. And the concept of sacrifice. Sacrifice it does mean different things to different people. It can mean, at one extreme, pain, even death. At other extremes, denial, such as fasting, for example. Fasting takes all manner of forms. And there are, for example, Buddhists who go around a mountain on their knees. And some Hindus will join them as well, on their knees, which is painful. I've seen stairways, actually seen a stairway that Christians go up on their knees, every single step, because it's painful. And there's a tendency, I'm not going to elaborate too far on this point, I want to get to the other one, but many of our fellow mortals seem to believe somewhere along this continuum that you have to pay a price to get heaven. That the idea that the 3 keys to the kingdom of heaven are sincerity, and more sincerity, and that you enter heaven by your faith is too good to be true. It's too easy. Can't be true. And the atonement doctrine fits into this very nicely, this tendency. You see it in the penitentes in Christianity, the more extreme version, or the Shias in Islam, another extreme example, where in both cases, groups of men and sometimes women flagellate themselves with a whip, and so forth. I'm not criticizing them. It's not for me to judge them as such. Nonetheless, they do it. They associate pain. That without pain, the price is too easy, too cheap. And the atonement doctrine in Christianity is all tied up with this tendency. The other point is we have a nickname of Urantia, of our planet, of our world, called the world of the cross. How far it goes, at least within the local universe of Nebulon, I do not know, but I imagine it'll go throughout the entire universe if it hasn't already, local universe, at the very least, eventually, if not now. And that's interesting. It's an ironic development that when it emerged, that we are named after the cross as a planet, planetary reputation, the world of the cross. These are not my words, it's the book's words. Urantia has become a shrine of all Nebadon. And in that context, we're known as the world of the cross. That's, of course, the crucifixion cross. And how that will affect, as inevitably it must, Christian theology and practice with regard to atonement, I do not know. But I'm certain it will affect it in ways that we can't now calculate. It's just too far removed from anything we know. But I have no doubt that this reputation, the world of the cross, will have some effect. Is it an affirmative reputation or negative? One could speculate either way. Jesus, Michael as Jesus, allowed it to happen. And it certainly reflected his love for us, that he allowed this to happen. It was God's will, and he obeyed God's will lovingly and without reservation. He was free to ask about that will as a man, as a mortal, but nonetheless he did obey it without hesitation. And that experience, the event of the cross, his crucifixion, is now embedded in the reputation of this planet. It's interesting. It's also one in closing. One wonders. I wonder anyway. In what other ways would Urantia be so known? Will there be additional nicknames, characterizations, directly resulting from the experience of Jesus? Will it happen with regard to this book, this revelation? Will we become known as the world of the book? Not a book, the book. I don't know. But I think as we reflect upon all this, on these questions, the atonement doctrine, etc., the religion about Jesus in contrast to of Jesus, there are certain thoughts, words, phrases, and events have not yet happened that will happen, that will emerge, that will have a direct bearing on the whole thing. I suppose, on balance, Neil, that that's hopeful, not fearful. That's all.
Charles, when I made a comment at the beginning, I was being a little bit playful, and I agreed that your comments were hopeful in the balance that you gave them. I would say that one of the difficulties we have is that we are bounded by our time in the conceptual sense, by our time experience. And Urantia as a planet is definitely a work in progress. We are destined for the eras of light and life. And if we think that our era is the crucial era, I assure you that those who come after us in subsequent generations will believe that their era is the crucial era. And perhaps the observers from other planets throughout our local universe may be inclined to focus on subsequent developments in the history of our planet as it becomes closer to the errors of light and life, that they find more helpful and more inspiring. Doreen, I believe you want to add again, please.
Yeah, just a little, not again, it's the first time I'm adding.
Before you were contributing and now you're adding. Right?
Oh, it was just something Charles said. And the book actually said that Jesus, he thought atonement was pitiful and pathetic. And he said that God was a loving father and just and merciful. And there was no racial guilt to atone for or, ransom. He just, he said, he wanted to say it when they were talking about it, but I think he got the message saying, your hour has not come and don't stir it. Don't say anything. But he did think it because the book quotes him as that was his thinking at the time. But, and also, I think there was something, and Charles did mention this previously, the book mentioned something about the seraphim are instrumental in supplanting the atonement idea by the concept of divine attunement. And I think that's a great way to do it, to transition. Divine attunement, that's positive. That's something, just spell it a little differently and put another definition in. Anyway, that's all. I'll cut it. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like now to move to the next topic on page 109, subsection C, Doctrines and Creeds. Bob, would you be willing to read this rather short paragraph? It's only 4 lines.
Sure. Doctrines and Creeds. Although the atonement can correctly be considered Christianity's most prominent doctrine, religion also advances a range of other standard teachings amounting to methods intended to guide and control believers, while simultaneously promoting uniformity and discouraging original, imaginative, or creative thinking.
Thank you. We have been discussing atonement, and of course, it really is the overwhelmingly central doctrine of Christianity. Last week, for example, we talked about the controversy between Augustine of Hippo and Pelagius on matters pertaining to grace and God's relationship to grace and the possibility of acquiring a perfectibility of character and a proper behavior through personal choice, human free will, as opposed to a teaching wherein Augustine, in effect, seemed to portray God as controlling the behavior of human beings by granting grace. Now, this is a relatively obscure idea in the context of Christian emphasis on Jesus' life, but it is nevertheless important in terms of our understanding of human free will and the consequences. So the controversy is an example of the doctrines and creeds that Christianity developed over a period of time that are somewhat related to the central message of the atonement of Jesus' death on the cross, but that constrain believers in terms of a search for uniformity and control from the upper levels, the principle of authority and hierarchy. Now, we have somewhat discussed the previous ideas about authority and hierarchy, especially when we were talking about my essay, Romanita. But I wonder whether the emphasis on uniformity is something that still prevails in Christianity, the desire to maintain a certain set of doctrines and principles and to keep everyone within the reservation, to ensure that everyone follows the lead of those in authority who are the leaders of a particular denomination. Charles, would you look at that question?
Well, I think the answer, in my opinion, is yes. Uniformity is very much the effect of having entrenched doctrines and creeds. Entrenched in the sense that the individual believer, the individual person, is not at liberty to discard them. And I have read in the past year or so of a number of excommunications in various religions because certain doctrines were not adhered to. One issue is in reference to abortion, but there are many, many others. And this is a natural tendency to, when you have a priesthood, a established clergy that has specialized criteria for membership, and they generally do, but not always, but they generally do. And this is a natural result. In the Protestant world, in Christianity, we see a lot less of this. Typically, the clergy are referred to as reverend or minister so-and-so or reverend so-and-so. In the Roman Catholic world and the Orthodox world, we have a tendency to see the opposite reflection of doctrines and creeds. Not the opposite, but a even stronger manifestation, demonstration. But I'm touching on item D, the subtopic of special status for the clergy. Entrenchment of doctrines and creeds, it seems to me, has to lead to uniformity and conformity, both. If you carry it far enough, as the late medieval church, Christian church, did, it would become totalitarian, where thought becomes a crime, or thought can be a crime, and punishable in many cases by death, torture and death. It helps to strengthen, reinforce, solidify the material anthropomorphic structure of organized religion, Christianity and others likewise. And doctrines and creeds are inevitable once a certain structure is adopted. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. George, I would like to turn to you next, but before I do that, I would like to add something to what Charles has said. He correctly observed that the emphasis on doctrines and creeds and the strictness about uniformity is more actively insisted upon in the Roman Catholic tradition than in the Protestant tradition. But let me point you toward a particular instance within the past few years whereby a Protestant denomination, I believe the Methodist Church, disbarred and expelled a minister because the minister, had conducted a marriage ceremony between two males, one of whom was his son. And so, in effect, by doing this, he violated the teachings of the Methodist Church that marriage consists only of a union between one man and one woman. And the Methodist Church expelled him as a minister of that church and, in effect, denied him the right to teach from the perspective of the Methodist Church. So, why is this particular doctrine so problematic? And do you consider that an emblem or a symbol of the intolerance for different views?
Well, you really threw me a nice curveball there. Thank you.
You're adopting Bob's vocabulary, which is fine.
However, I do have an answer, which goes back to, of course, the Urantia book, which says religion should never get involved in the social mores. In other words, there's that, I forget exactly where it is, where it says what Pauline Christianity was a new order of society that came upon the Roman world. And that's not what, in other words, it involved all aspects of human culture, human society. It wasn't just about religion, it was about everything. It was a whole social order. And that's where this falls into. Gay marriage, abortion, all of these things They're all questions of the social order. They're all matters for social reform. And religion should not be involved in these things because they change from decade to decade. People's attitudes change. People come to different conclusions. In fact, I see this as a real problem for not just the Methodist Church, but also for the Catholic Church. They keep stepping in, well, not keep, for a long time, all churches have stepped into this role of monitoring and reforming the social order instead of carrying out their real charge, which is teaching the gospel of the kingdom. I mean, what does any of this have to do with the gospel of the kingdom? It has nothing directly to do with it. So if they want to go off, I don't know. I don't even know if I'm answering your question anymore. But my feeling is that it's an issue that does not need to occur in religion, because religion should be about spiritual matters, not about questions of the social order. If particular churches, this particular Methodist church has a particular, if this is the majority view, this is, they think the social order requires them in their Methodist church community to expel somebody, well, then that's their choice. That's the social order they want. But the idea of trying to relate that back to God and religion and spiritual development, I think, is where all the error occurs.
Thank you. I simply would like to confirm that you believe that this case does involve the premise of the heading Doctrines and Creeds,
Yes.
and that in effect this is an example of an insistence on a particular doctrine and creed. I agree with you that that particular doctrine is related to the social organization of society and not really to the core mission of religion or of the kingdom of God, as you have explained it. Bob, why do you think that doctrines and creeds have become a hallmark of traditional Christianity?
Well, I think we're talking a little bit about control here for sure. Let me put some context around why I think that's the case. I've been supporting the DoD as a contractor for quite a number of years. And there's a concept that's nothing but an acronym. It's called it sounds .milf. It's it's DOT MLPF, and D stands for doctrine. It's the top of the order. Doctrine. Let me just state what it means. So the doctrine in the military, or at least in the DoD part, is built as policy, and it's the formulation of the way that they would fight, typically in a joint warfare type thing, situation. Everything else under doctrine is then in support of that. The organization, which is the O, the training, the material, the leadership, personnel, and facilities. So I build that. I put that out there as a context for what I think is a real differentiation between the religious or the theological doctrine versus the way that this social order of military builds their policy. It's very flexible. Doctrine is very flexible in the military. And there's a process that says, here's how we should change our doctrine based on technology, based on the changes in organization, how we see management and leadership, etc. But juxtaposed to that, I think, and what George just brought up, so I'm really supporting this, I think, and that is that religion shouldn't get involved in that, because it can't move off the dead center of focus that this is a doctrine that we have to build to be able to support all those other things that we're trying to maintain. It's almost like a lie telling a lie. You know, you get into a network of these things, and you wind up that you have to harden that, and it's a psychosclerotic format. You can't change that doctrine, and that's one of the reasons I think why I see, at least in my opinion of it, as to why religion ought to be spiritually oriented, because it's a dynamic process. It's about the personal religious experience, personal spiritual experience of each and every individual that is summated into a religion. So, George, excellent point. And I thought of an area where the social order needs to be able to have a dynamic set of doctrines, and I don't think that can happen in a religion or a theology.
Well, maybe if I could ask you to clarify the last statement, is this impossible in a religious context, or just impossible in a context in which a religion emphasizes uniformity of belief?
Well, the doctrine in the military is for the uniformity in the way that they approach the function of warfare and other things. And because there's a process built based on externalities that change, what we see out of religions is that these externalities cause issues, and it causes a hardening of this doctrine. I hope I answered the question there, Neil. I just see a huge juxtaposition between the religious area of doctrine and the human, social, secular area of doctrine.
I understand that the question is indeed complicated. Basically, what I was trying to do by asking what I did was to discuss whether it is possible to move away from religion based on uniformity of belief to a kind of religion of personal spiritual experience based on mutual respect, based on an individual's awareness of God and the spiritual values of others. So in effect, my question has to do with whether these attributes of Christianity, doctrines and creeds, can be succeeded by other attributes in the future for a more desirable form of religion that is not based on uniformity of belief, but that is based on mutual love and mutual respect. Doreen, your turn.
Okay. I really wasn't going to speak on this topic, but listening to what the rest of you had said, it reminded me of, I was reading something about a woman in France who was questioned about Christianity, and she said, when they changed it from Latin to French, she said it lost something in the transition. And she said, I was very disappointed and I stopped going. So you can't please everybody. I believe I don't see God as discriminating. I never did. I think he loves all his children, as it says. And we have to love, if we love God, we have to love our brother. And I don't care if we start to pick and choose who's our brother. And the climate has changed in society and it'll continue to change. I think that probably it's up to the parish priest whether he wants to do something or not. I think it's a terrible thing to discriminate against a human being who wants to keep their faith. And just because today your sexuality has changed, what about people whose sex change from male to female or female to male? Do we not want to engage them as well? You're opening up a terrible can of worms. I think doctrines, number one, that was just one of the things I wanted to say. The other was also to speak of what Bob said, that to change the rules in the military. Well, I remember in the last administration, the military was really upset when they changed the rules of engagement and they couldn't kill the enemy without permission. So a lot of the military were outrageous on that change. But on the other hand, now, I think it's healthy, number one, to kind of change the doctrine somewhat, not radically, and everything should be a little adjustment because it makes them more interesting. How about just changing the wording, the way it's worded with the same meaning, or maybe enlarge the meaning? If I went to some institution and they repeated the same thing to me all the time, to me, I stopped thinking. It's boring. It doesn't repercuss inside me. What does it do? It's just the same old expectation, and maybe many people love that. But as an individual, I'm speaking for myself, it has no appeal, because I did go to my grandkids, they both graduated the Catholic schools and very good education there, and I had no problem, but I did go to some of the services. And the old rituals and the doctrines and the things they said sometimes were just very unappealing. But when you had a priest that came in with a new sermon and something that appealed to everybody regardless, they sat up and listened. It just resonates. Your mind starts to open up. Otherwise, it's like the dead, what do they call it? The dead forms of knowledge. It doesn't, it's just the same information. Of course, because I didn't grow up in it. So I'm speaking totally, as a person that doesn't have any experience in that. And if you're a child and you go and this is the expectation, but then look at the churches, how empty they are. So what is it, how do you get people to stay and how do you get new people to come in? Maybe you need, what did they say? Fresh ideas, fresh ways to do instead of the old wineskins with the old wine. I find that's one thing the Urantia book always resonated in me, that said, there is nothing but change. There is no such thing as static. The universe operates on change constantly, but it's gradual change, not overnight to throw everything out, but I think a little bit, is refreshing. I would find it anyway. So that's my story. Thank you for asking.
Well, thank you for your contributions. And I suppose that you have established that you were contributing rather than adding. But now I'm going to ask you to add just a little bit. Is the point here that uniformity is not required, or is the point that respect for spiritual experience and individual understanding and individual relationship is the center? Are we simply discarding the idea of uniformity, or are we really trying to move toward respect for personal spiritual experience?
Well, definitely spiritual experience is the teacher for an individual to understand. Doctrine is just, it's not experience, it's just something that you were trained to think of. And I think it's good, like in school, they teach you, yes, certain things are, you have to know, as an understanding, and you can repeat that all the time, and that's good. I don't think you have to throw everything one way or the other, because it shifts gradually. So you do a little bit. And then I think that it may resonate differently with people. I can't answer that entirely, but I just find it doesn't have to be all this or all that. It's the pendulum swings both ways. But if it stayed in the middle, the pendulum, the higher the swing, the higher up the pendulum, the less the swing, and it becomes more acceptable. So it's like the left and the right and all this nonsense in between. It only makes people crazy and angry. But that's what I said. Everything is patience and tolerance and a little bit. And there will always be the old-fashioned way to do things. And then we'll see how it works in society, whether there are, the new people or the younger generations, the millenniums, whatever, they're searching. And I understand they're searching a lot now. I read some of the stuff, and they're looking for meaning and spirituality and love and brotherhood and sisterhood. They want to come together. They don't want to be apart by some doctrine or dictation of the past. So you have to really open up your mind and know your audience. I don't know, what each parish does, or the priest determines what he's going to do. It's, that to me is an individual, personal experience for them.
Thank you. I would like now to contribute what I hope will be a type of unifying set of remarks to wrap up this question of looking at doctrines and creeds. To me, the idea of doctrines and creeds is completely associated with three aspects of the characteristics described in my essay, Romanità: authority, hierarchy, and uniformity. Authority from above decides what is to be believed. Hierarchy enforces it through the chain of command, and uniformity insists that it must be the same. So, by implication, doctrines and creeds carry forward this heritage that we have from the premise of authority, the premise of hierarchy, the premise of uniformity, associated with the emergence of organized institutional Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Roman Empire in ways that are still recognizable today. In other words, Christianity embodied those elements, and it still embodies this emphasis on doctrines and creeds. We are describing here, we have all talked about other possible approaches, but we all seem to agree that this practice of doctrines and creeds insisting on uniformity is a very deep characteristic of Christianity as it exists. It may not be quite as deep as the atonement doctrine, but the atonement doctrine, in effect, is an example of a doctrine and a creed and the principle of uniformity. We will next week go on to the segment called Special Status for the Clergy. Charles mentioned it very briefly in some of his remarks, saying that his comments about doctrines and creed, in effect, trended over somewhat into the idea of the special status of the clergy, and that is true. I would like now to introduce an element that I described in my announcement message and that I circulated to all of you several days before this webinar, and it has to do with the fact that the Midweyer Commission described in an early paragraph of Section 8 of Paper 195. And this has to do with the question of how secularism originated in the first place as a revolt against the domination of Western society by the church. This is from the second half of the second paragraph in Section 8 of Paper 195. The mother of modern I quote, "The mother of modern secularism was the totalitarian medieval Christian church. Secularism had its inception as a rising protest against the almost complete domination of Western civilization by the institutionalized Christian church," unquote. So this is a reality of history. This is what happened for approximately 1,000 years. It had intellectual consequences, it had social consequences, it had political consequences. Excuse me. So in preparation for this webinar, I circulated to you an excerpt from a philosophy lecture that in its title had to do with Hippocrates and the development of the Greek tradition of medicine. But in the excerpt, the author Daniel Robinson, talked about the domination of society by virtue of a hierarchy of clergy. And in my opinion, this example, this analysis that he gave is profoundly interesting from the perspective of what actually happened in Christianity. This is not a document that has the authority of the Midwear Commission. It is not part of the teachings of the Urantia book. And for that matter, it is not an intrinsic part of our document that we are considering Revelation Revealed. But to me, it affords a very interesting sidelight on the question of the complete domination of Western society by the medieval church. So I circulated this material to you several days ago. We are not going to have the time today to go all the way through the material, but I would like to read the first two paragraphs myself as an introduction to the discussion that we will proceed to conduct and conclude next week. This is from the segment of the lecture by Professor Daniel Robinson, and it is a lecture that is available in a series of CDs that are marketed by the Great Courses Company, also known as the Teaching Company. Here I begin from the lecture by Daniel Robinson. Now this perspective becomes a perspective available only to those who have not accepted priestcraft as having epistemological authority. Whatever problems are to be addressed by oracles and priests, the problem of knowledge is not one of them, at least as this problem arises from the facts of the material world. And I do want to underscore this. It is a point worth repeating. Something momentous takes place when a culture takes the position that the problem of knowledge is essentially a religious problem and invests its credulity in a denominated group of official interpreters whose judgments on matters of this kind are taken to be incorrigible. Here, I do not presume to weigh the claims of religion and the claims of the secular world. My own guess is that for every secularly produced fact, there may be some profound religious truth on which it depends. But here, the complexity of the case and the shortness of life incline me, at any rate, to silence. What I am testing instead are the implications that follow, depending upon which of the positions is taken as a person or culture sets out to solve problems arriving from life in the real world. That's the end of the quotation of the first two paragraphs from this lecture. In effect, what the professor, what the philosopher is talking about is the relationship between religion and society in general, or if you prefer, religion and the full range of human life. And during the Middle Ages, the church became the ultimate arbiter of all aspects of human life. It was the authority of the clergy who established themselves as the authorities in all regards that human beings living under those circumstances in these centuries of Christianity were obliged to honor. Now, let me at least offer the opportunity to examine the final sentence in the first paragraph that I read. And for the purposes of offering an opportunity to comment, I shall reread that sentence. It goes as follows. Something momentous takes place when a culture takes the position that the problem of knowledge is essentially a religious problem and invests its credulity in a denominated group of official interpreters whose judgments on matters of this kind are taken to be incorrigible. I focus your attention on the phrase, the problem of knowledge, and the next phrase, a religious problem. The question that the professor is posing is whether the problem of knowledge as knowledge and predominantly about the world that we live in is or is not a religious problem, and what happens when an entrenched group of clerical authorities declare that it is a religious problem. Bob, would you at least offer us some preliminary remarks on the understanding that we will indeed explore this in more detail next week?
Sure, that's a real profound sentence, Neil. I highlighted that, and I also highlighted knowledge is essentially a religious problem, as well as momentous and incorrigible. Let me take momentous first, because he's saying here that with this particular context, that there's a group of individuals in society that contain all knowledge, and it's a religious group to begin with. I think goes back to the point that George brought up earlier, where the religious groups should not be dictating the normal things in society, because what we find here is that these then I want to bring up the word incorrigible. They're not to be changed. Who's got who should have a focus, a center, the authority on human knowledge. And if you put it into a religious context, I think we'll see as he speaks later that it's going to result in philosophical analysis. I'm sorry, philosophical paralysis. Over.
And perhaps philosophical confusion as well.
Right.
I would agree with that.
Right.
George, Bob correctly referred to some of your previous comments. I wonder if you would like to refer to some of Bob's comments, or at least give us your preliminary analysis of these questions that I have posed.
This is the secularism is a really interesting and powerful force, has been, especially recently. In terms of the sentence you read, a little bit, he's being a little bit circular. He's writing from a secular perspective and saying priests who try to talk about secular knowledge don't know what they're talking about, which is kind of obvious in a sense. It would be like, and then, the confusion over the word knowledge. What does it mean to say that you have knowledge of the life and teachings of Jesus? What does science have to say about that kind of knowledge? It has absolutely nothing to say. It can't evaluate it. It can't understand it. It would be like a Methodist minister trying to tell quantum physicists what a photon does when it's going through slits. I mean, you've got to know where you got to stay in your own lane, to put it in colloquial language. And so, his statement that the clergy doesn't know anything about science or scientific knowledge is, well, scientists don't really know anything about spiritual knowledge, especially if they haven't looked at it.
Thank you, George. I appreciate your idea of staying in your own lanes, which is, of course, a metaphor from the road system. I would offer you a paraphrase of a slightly higher level of discourse and talk about distinguishing different realms of thought and experience. And I think that, in effect, amounts to an alternate way of expressing the idea of staying in one's own lane. Doreen, your turn.
So do I understand the question is they don't want you to think knowledge has to be approved? I mean, I'm just not really understanding. It reminds me of Nazism or, a totalitarian government where China, I think, does that now too. to say.
I could
What?
paraphrase the sentence by saying that it amounts to saying that this group of priests, this group of clerics, proclaim themselves to be authorities on all topics whatsoever. And that this is the problem that Professor Robinson is examining.
So I would say, is there nothing to learn? Is there everything that they know, all knowledge within them? How could that be possible if they're receptive to the spirit teachings in religion? You know, where is inspiration? Where does the ideas come from? How can you have a monopoly on knowledge? I mean, it's the antithesis of everything that we believe that we're given. That, you know, that we have mind. Do we limit the mind to appease a certain group of people? I mean, to me, it's just beyond something that I would ever come to understand. How anybody could tell me, don't, you know, that we know. It's like a parent telling a child, I know what's right for you, and the kid is rebelling. No, you don't. That's the individual opportunity, that the uniqueness of every human being to think for themselves, develop your mind, explore, reach out into the cosmic, understand the unity of, you know, of life. How do you limit that? And why wouldn't you allow for free thinking and exchange of ideas? It just behooves me. I mean, I have no words to say.
Thank you. I think you have grasped the ridiculousness of this situation, but nonetheless, it is a reality in terms of what actually happened during this period of 1,000 years, from approximately 500 to 1500 in the current era. As one example, I would like to mention the question of lending money at interest. And for most of this period, the Roman Catholic Church had the doctrine that it was forbidden to lend money at interest. And Western civilization, ended up in a situation in which this prohibition on lending money at interest applied to Christians, but it did not apply to Jewish people, who became the moneylenders. And then we had a great deal of cultural consequences of this, and stereotypes and so on, which have not entirely died now. But the point is, the church, as it stood, had no business in making this kind of a statement about the economy, about investment, about economic growth. Nonetheless, it did. And in effect, society had to overcome this gradually. Charles, I offer you the opportunity to follow that, or to explore some other element of this discussion that happens to appeal to you.
Well, there are fundamental differences here, all of which are necessary to understand reality. That is, what is real. Science draws our attention to facts, essentially. Religion draws our attention to faith. Facts, from the point of view of science, are established through an empirical process known as the scientific method, one of observation and verification. And that's repeated until causality or causation to effect is reasonably established. When it's reasonably established, for example, then it's considered a fact. For example, smallpox is caused by I believe, a certain kind of bacteria, not a spirit punishment from God. On the other hand, as Jesus taught, the keys to the kingdom of heaven are sincere faith, more sincere faith, more sincere faith. From one point of view, both are implausible to each other, but they're not really from another point of view. You take the paradise viewpoint, the viewpoint from above, the viewpoint that begins with complexity, not simplicity, but complexity. You can see how both are essential to know something about, to experience something about, to understand reality. Because you need to use the tripartite distinctions in your answer book, you need facts, meanings, and values to understand reality. Facts wouldn't be enough by themselves, and values or faith wouldn't be enough by itself, neither would meanings. He couldn't get meanings without combining facts and values, or facts and faith. It seems to me. And that science is not, therefore, is not at war with religion, and religion, therefore, is not at war with science, although some scientists and some religionists may indeed be at war with each other. But that, in my opinion, that's their shtick. That's their problem. A story, quickly. When Galileo was doing his research and observing, one of the first to use the telescope to observe the heavens, what was referred to as the heavens, that which is above us, the stars, planets, such as they were known, he discovered, evidently, from what I've read, I read a copy of his notebook. I used to have my students read it, and we would discuss it. 4 moons of Jupiter. Jupiter has more than 4, but there were 4. If you look in a relatively low-power telescope, you can see the 4 moons. They look like they're hanging by themselves. One looks for the string or cable that's holding them up. It's a very interesting. It's a fascinating phenomenon to observe through a low-power telescope. Evidently, Galileo may have shown one of the cardinals, a critic of his, or maybe 2 cardinals, what he saw in his telescope. Because, he was apprehended and tried. And for this new exploration of knowledge, his approach to this problem of knowledge. And one of the cardinals, possibly, said to him, well, this knowledge is useless. It has no value. It's worthless. It's not from Scripture. Nothing in Scripture indicates that the planet Jupiter has 4 moons. And Galileo said, no, it is, or he basically argued, it is valid, but it's using a different test. It's not using the test of faith. I'm grossly paraphrasing and summarizing. It's using the test of science, test of observation, empiricism. That's a test. It's a different test. And it doesn't contradict, or it isn't intended to disparage Scripture, knowledge derived from Scripture or implied by Scripture, but rather we're discovering a new area of knowledge, what you referred to, or Robinson referred to as the problem of knowledge. It's a different approach. It's a different basis. Again, empiricism in contrast, apparent contrast to faith. Of course, in paradise, there is no issue here, but there is down here. In time and space, there may be an illusion of that they're separate, when there may be some way in eternity to reconcile them, or maybe that they don't have to be reconciled. But down here, that would seem to be the case. It seems to me that our co-religionists and our scientists should at least be tolerant. The scientists should practice the injunction of avoiding bias, bigotry, and prejudice toward others outside the empirical method, the scientific method, the empirical process. Co-religionists, on the other hand, should avoid bias, bigotry, and prejudice when viewing the work of scientists, of science, and in establishing what is real, or at least trying to establish what is real, and the broader problem of knowledge that all of them have to deal with. If you're smug about it, for instance, to borrow a phrase from a contemporary issue that I'll only allude to indirectly, there is no such thing as settled science, in the sense that it's now all hypothesizing is over. No. What do we know about gravity, for example? What we believe about gravity, what do we know about gravity? Well, that's subject to change. As Doreen pointed out, matter, mind, and spirit, the domains of matter, mind, and spirit, the realms of matter, mind, and spirit are subject to change. Personality, we know from the ancient book, is not. That's an absolute. But matter, mind, and spirit, the material or spiritual and the intellectual, are subject to change. And that's true for theology, and it's true for science, and vice versa. And it just takes a long evolutionary struggle to convince people of the merits of these different approaches. It's a level of sophistication, of insight, that there's a tendency to avoid, and whatever side you're on, whatever ice floe you happen to be standing on. But if you believe that there's one God, that is, there's one source and center, ultimately, absolutely, and the Father Infinite is the source and center, not a source and center. That would be an oxymoron. Is the source and center. If you believe that, if you postulate that, then it seems to me there's no real problem here between facts, meanings, and values, any more than trying to understand destiny, origin, history, and destiny, that you must do to understand a phase of reality. To understand the origin, history, and destiny, sooner or later you're going to have to deal with facts. Sooner or later you're going to have to deal with values and the related faith, and sooner or later with meanings derived from the first two, and plus experience. And there are characteristics that could be described as involving what we call faith, a leap of what we think is real, and what we could describe as factual, what we claim we know is real. And if you boil water at a certain altitude, at a certain time, if you heat water at a certain altitude, certain temperature, every single time it seems to boil. Every single time. So we call that result a fact. And we go from there, and in trying to understand the problem of knowledge, which is to attempt to understand what's real and what's not real. In the search for truth, to phrase it another way, there are two pitfalls: delusion and fraud. One might add illusion as well. It's kind of but in any case, those are pitfalls. They're to be avoided. What's left should be what is true. What is true, however, again, necessarily, I'll repeat myself, necessarily entails facts, meanings, and values, which is why the Urantia book phrased it that way. It's very rare to come across a exposition in which the author states those three domains, and the implication is they can and may be integrated. And so, again, science does its thing, and religion does its thing, and philosophy then does its thing. So does history, and so does art. There's a need for all five to understand what is real. And I've heard people say, well, I don't understand poetry. I can't relate to poetry. So they dismiss poetry as a phenomenon. They dismiss it as a mode of literature because they can't relate to it for whatever reason. Well, that's their prerogative, but in many ways it's a silly attitude. You're not going to read any poems, you're not going to read any poetry because you don't get a charge from it, or you don't get uplifted by it. Can you not learn from it? Would you take that approach to history? Well, I don't like so-and-so. I don't like George Washington, for example. I'm not going to read about him. Well, I'm going to disparage him. That sort of thing. The intolerance that's exhibited by co-religionists, some of our co-religionist friends and some of our scientific friends, is reprehensible. And again, I'll close with this. Galileo, I believe, was correct. In essence, the implication, his position was correct. Science is not at war necessarily at all with religion. Religion is not at war with science.
I totally agree with you in that conclusion, which is obvious to us. It should be obvious to any careful and serious reader of the Urantia book. If I go back to the story about Galileo that you told, I would offer you a brief comment. I would say that for Galileo, what was important was his observation that certain moons were revolving around the planet Jupiter, whereas for the Roman Catholic cleric, the important point was his conviction that everything on Earth revolved around the Vatican. And this was, in effect, a cultural collision wherein we need, as you in effect have implied, to come up with a balanced approach that blends facts, meanings, and values, that respects every different level of experience and knowledge, and accords to each its proper role and emphasis. So
just to add something you just said, Neil, if I may.
Yes, you may.
I've seen medieval maps of the world, that is, they were presented as maps of the world, which supports your generalization, that show Jerusalem at the center of the world. I've seen medieval maps that were done by Muslims that puts Mecca at the center of the world. In a way, I thought to myself when I saw these maps, albeit I couldn't read the languages, but nonetheless the editor described them as to what the viewer was looking at. I thought to myself, well, it tells a tale. Therein lies the problem. You know, it's the presumption that you are the center of the world, the center of the universe, the center of etc. But you're the center. That's an interesting thought. In my opinion, there's only one center, and only one person who's the central, and that's the Universal Father. And albeit I am one of his children, I am a son of God. I'm also a cosmic citizen in benign league with the Supreme Being, the Supreme of time and space. And I'm working in tandem with the Supreme as a cosmic citizen. At the same time, I have the Father relationship, and that's all that is true, I believe. And I think it's true for every other personality. And I guess that's a dogmatic statement. It's the only dogma I've ever attached myself to. There is no other. It's the only dogma. And if it is a dogma, then it is. And I'm holding fast to that. But beyond that, I am free to choose. As far as I'm concerned, I'm free to choose as I see fit, and as I understand God's will to so direct me. But I'm still free to choose. And I follow, this may be a statement that's also dogmatic. But it isn't meant to be. It's not a prescription for anybody else, just a personal statement. It's not dogmatic in that sense. I follow Michael of Nebadon, Jesus of Nazareth, and him only. I follow no man or woman. I follow no angel or midway, no Melchizedek or Most High. I follow only Michael of Nebadon, or Jesus of Nazareth. And through him, the Son, I believe I follow the Father. And if I have a theology, that would essentially be it. If I have a theological frame of reference. But nothing I said is contradictory to determining what is fact and what is not. Or for that matter, what is real in regard to faith and what is not real. What is delusion or fraud or illusion. I mean, a novel uses illusion, so we'll leave a novel out. We'll leave illusion out of it. A novel is illusion that serves the search for truth, the expression of truth. I'll just limit it to fraud and delusion. Of the two of them, I think delusion is the greater pitfall. If as a teacher, as a veteran teacher, if I was asked, what is the biggest deficiency, it might well be the tendency to be deluded and to believe that it's real. But that can be done by any co-religionist or any scientist or any follower of religion or any follower of science or any philosopher or student of philosophy, for that matter, or any artist or any art, for that matter, possibly. Not art, but any artist or devotee, and so forth. And history, the same thing. It applies to history. And it's a heck of an issue. It's a heck of an issue.
Well, Charles, I will take your concluding comments that it's a heck of an issue as a praise for the underlying direction of our discussion, which we will certainly continue next week. We're exploring the relationship between religion and all other aspects of culture and intellectual life on our planet. We will continue reading the rest of the 2 pages by the lecturer concerning philosophy. And we will then proceed to section 8 of section 8 of paper 195, a section that has the heading Secular Totalitarianism. So there will be many opportunities for all of you to contribute to that. It is definitely a case of the need for correct balance and for all of us and for humanity as a whole to understand the appropriate roles of religion and other aspects of human life on our planet Euratia. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for an extremely interesting discussion, an extremely interesting webinar. And I will see at least some of you next week. Thank you.
Thank
Roger
you.
that. Bye-bye.